Lecture 5, we're going to expand on government intervention and introduce taxes and subsidies. Taxes is probably a term that you're very familiar with. We're just going to talk in this class about a very specific type of tax. If you continue on in economics, you will definitely talk about other types of taxes, things like your income taxes, and even more specific percentage taxes. We're just going to keep it very simple on a per unit tax based on the content that we need to cover in this course. I'm also going to introduce subsidies, something that we're typically not as familiar with, but we do sometimes experience these in our lives, and we do often hear about subsidies because it can be a very a popular issue among within politics. So when we're thinking about taxes, there are many different types of taxes, right? We can see our taxes on the receipts that we purchase, goods and services. We can see the taxes that we have to pay in terms of our income taxes, our property taxes, our taxes on our vehicles. And then there are also taxes that we don't necessarily see, and those would fall into the range of gasoline taxes. Often what we don't see are gasoline taxes. They're built already into the price, and the seller of gasoline, the gas station, they just post one price, and they don't split out each individual tax that is paid along the way. And so all of these different taxes can come in many forms. They can come on a per unit basis, like we see the federal gas tax. It's 18.4 cents per gallon, and that's the type of gas we're going to talk about. In the middle on that target receipt, the tax is 6% of your total. And so, and income taxes are going to be special cases, depending on how much income you have and all of the special deductions that take place. All right, so when the government is obviously very involved, and they levy taxes and subsidies on many goods and services. Sometimes we don't know about them, or we don't know exactly their amount because they're hidden within the price, and sellers are the ones that are actually writing out the check. That doesn't necessarily mean that we don't pay the tax. So even though you're writing out the check in terms of the target bill, and you see the 6% on your check or on your bill, and you're actually paying the tax, or in the case of the gasoline where the tax is just built in, it doesn't matter. Either way, the outcome is going to be exactly the same. And we're going to talk about why that's the case as we move forward. What we're going to look at is tax as a wedge between the demand and supply curves. So what happens when we issue a tax is that we're going to use an example here with pizza. And so let's say that there's a tax on pizza. So I pay a price, and that price is partially what the sellers receive. So they take a part of that, but I also pay the tax. And so our tax is going to drive a wedge in between what the buyers actually pay and what the sellers actually receive. And we're going to look at this graphically, and I think that'll make a little bit more sense as we're going forward. And again, it doesn't matter who pays the tax. It doesn't matter if it's the target receipt where I can see the tax, or something like the gas tax that's just built into the price. We're going to see the buyer and the seller split the tax. It's not necessarily going to be evenly. We're going to talk about how that's distributed, but they are going to split the tax in almost every case except the extreme cases. All right, so how do we determine this per unit tax? And again, what I'm talking about is for each unit bought or sold in the market, that unit has a set tax associated with it. So it's not a percent tax like our sales tax. It's not like our income tax, but it's more like the gas tax, where we say for each gallon of gas you purchase, you have to pay 18 cents. So that's a per unit tax. And so when we have a per unit tax, we are going to start at our equilibrium. So we're going to look at our graph, we're going to determine our equilibrium, and we're going to move to the left. And we're going to see why that's the case. But we're going to stop when the difference between the demand curve, which is going to be on the upper end, and the supply curve, which is going to be on the lower price, is equal to the tax. All right, so let's look at an example where we have a $1 tax added to this market for pizza. All right, so initially we can look at, we have an equilibrium of $1.50. At $1.50, there is 600 pizzas bought and sold in the market. All right, so now we know that it's not going to be the equilibrium that's charged anymore. What we're going to see is that buyers are going to get a receipt, and it's going to say pizza X dollars plus tax, and that tax is going to equal $1, and then your total is the X plus the $1. And so the price that sellers receive, or the price that the pizza place receives, is that X dollars. And we're going to denote that as PS, the price sellers receive. The total amount that I as a buyer pay, the price buyers pay, PV, is equal to the total, the bottom line. I have to pay this total X plus $1. Okay, so the price sellers receive is X. I pay $1 to the government, and then the total amount I pay is X plus 1. All right, so now what we need to do is start at our equilibrium and move to the left until the difference between the demand curve, which is going to be on the upper end, and the supply curve is $1. And that's actually going to happen here at our first set of points. Here we see that we hit this demand curve at $2, and we hit this supply curve at $1. So what we're doing is moving to the left quantities until the difference between the demand curve and the supply curve is 1. And we see that, and we can draw this wedge. This is going to be our tax wedge right in here. All right, so now what this bill looks like is pizza, $1. The sellers, where we hit the supply curve, where our tax wedge hits the supply curve, is $1. So a slice of pizza costs $1. Our tax is also $1, right? And then where do we hit the demand curve? We hit the demand curve at $2. That's X plus 1. Okay, so the price that buyers pay is equal to $2. That's the total bill. The price that sellers receive is $1. Okay? All right, so then we have that tax wedge of $1. And at these prices, so if the price is $2 for buyers, what is the quantity that's demanded? The quantity that's demanded is 400 units. What's the quantity that's supplied at $1? 400 units. All right, so if you'd like to fast forward a little bit, that's fine, but I'm going to work through this one more time. I'm just going to clear my screen, and I'm going to work through it one more time so we can look at it a little more closely. All right, the government comes in and says there's a $1 tax on the market for pizza. And so that means that the sellers are going to charge a price for their pizza. And again, let's call that X. Then they're going to say, well, you have to pay a tax of $1. And so the total then that the buyers will have to pay is going to be X plus 1. Okay? And so we have to start at our equilibrium, and we're going to move to the left because we need that price that buyers pay to be higher, $1 higher than the price sellers receive. Okay, the price sellers receive is determined by the supply curve. The price buyers pay is determined by the demand curve. So we need the difference between, we need the demand curve to be $1 above the supply curve. And that happens right here. The demand curve is at $2. The supply curve is at $1. And so the price sellers receive is that intersection between our tax wedge and the supply curve. And so X in this case, or the price that sellers receive, is equal to $1. That's where our supply curve and our tax wedge hit. I pay my $1 tax, and when I pay my $1 tax, the total amount that I have to pay, $1 goes towards the pizza, $1 goes to the government, and the price buyers pay, which is X plus 1, is equal to $2. Okay, so the tax was equal to 1, so the price sellers receive plus the tax is equal to the price buyers pay. All right, and then we want to think about, okay, so what's the quantity? What is the quantity equal to? Well, how much is demanded when the price is $2? If the price is $2, the quantity that I demand is right here, and that is 400 units. All right, what if the price sellers receive is $1? What would be the supply if the price was $1? Well, where do we hit the supply curve? We hit it right here, 400. So the amount of pizzas bought and sold in the market is 400. The price buyers pay went from 150 to 200, so the price went up. The law of demand tells us that as price increases, the quantity demanded decreases. Sellers used to receive $1.50, now they only receive $1, so the price they receive went down, and since sellers like high prices, the law of supply tells us as price decreases, the quantity supplied decreases. So our equilibrium quantity is no longer the quantity. Both our buyers and our sellers reduced the amount that they produce and consume to 400. So the tax resulted in buyers paying a higher price, sellers receiving a lower price, and our quantity decreasing. All right, so I have that tax wedge in there for us now. So once the $1 tax wedge is found, we found the price buyers pay, we found price sellers receive, we compared them to the equilibrium. So they used to pay $1.50, now buyers pay $200. Sellers used to receive $1.50, now they receive $1. So we can compare those, and we can see how has their life in this pizza market changed, and we see that both buyers are less happy because buyers used to pay $1.50, now they pay $2. They're less happy about this, and they're 50 cents less happy about that, right? The difference between the equilibrium, what they used to pay, and now what they pay with the tax. Sellers are also less happy, and they're also 50 cents less happy. Why? Because they used to receive $1.50, now they only receive $1. And this burden, how much unhappier each of our market participants, is measured through tax incidence. Tax incidence measures measures the tax burden of each market participant. So if you can't see that part, it says market participant. All right, so as we continue on, so buyers, they first paid the $1.50, and I did this also. I would make sure I remembered to talk about each coin. So they used to pay the equilibrium price. The government introduced the tax, and now they have to pay $2. So they pay 50 cents of this tax. Okay, and we can see this based on the difference between the new price buyers pay and their old equilibrium. Okay, so this right here is the price of tax by the buyers. I should say by, not. Okay. The sellers, they used to receive $1.50. They used to receive the equilibrium. Now they receive $1. So the difference between our equilibrium and the new price that they receive. And the sellers pay 50 cents of the tax. All right, and so the total tax, remember, is $1. So the amount the buyers pay plus the amount the sellers receive or pay should be equal to $1. And so buyers pay 50 cents of the tax, sellers pay 50 cents of the tax for the total tax of $1. And this is what we call the tax incidence. How much sorry, that's not legible, but how much of the tax does each market participant pay? And what we're going to find as we go through an example is going to be that it's going to depend on elasticity. The tax incidence depends on elasticity. All right, so again, what happened to quantity? We were initially at 600, but at a price of $2, the new price buyers pay. The quantity that they demand will be 400. At the price of $1, what's the new quantity sellers will supply? Well, they're less happy about this lower price, so some of them left the market, and they only supply 400 units. So 400 is going to be the amount bought and sold in the market. The quantity decreased based on the tax. All right, so let's work through an example, and I want you to pause now and go through and determine if the government imposes a tax of $30, what's going to happen to quantity, the price buyers pay, and the price sellers receive. All right, so pause now, go through, and see if we come up with the same answers. All right, so hopefully you paused for a little bit and you've started to think about, okay, what does this look like in terms of our market? So we can look at first our equilibrium. We start out equilibrium price of 100, equilibrium quantity of 100. All right, so let's actually just label that as maybe a P, and let's put this as a Q. All right, so now we have a $30 tax, and when we do our tax, remember our price buyers pay, and this doesn't have a demand curve label. Sorry, it doesn't have a supply curve label or a demand curve label. Remember, our demand curve has to be above our supply curve, and we want that wedge to be $30. The difference between what the buyers pay and what the sellers receive to be $30. Well, here it looks like this might be maybe $105 compared to $90, and that's not a tax wedge of $30. That's only about a $15 tax wedge, and so we know we need to continue on. And here we can look at this wedge, and this is 110 versus 80, and now we have a $30 tax wedge. And so we know our tax is going to fall right here in this spot. And so here we have our tax where we hit the demand curve. Remember, here's where we hit the demand curve, and that must be the price that buyers pay. So the new price that buyers pay is going to be 110. The price buyers pay goes up. And now the price that sellers receive has gone down to 80. Okay? And so we know price buyers pay is equal to 110. Price sellers receive is 80. Okay, so let's just look one more time. So what they're going to say, and this is the market for hotel rooms. So your hotel room costs $80 plus a tax, and that tax is $30. And that means that the total is 110, and that's exactly what we see here. This is the price sellers receive. This is the price that buyers pay. All right, so now what is the quantity? Well, what's the quantity demanded if the price is 110? If the price is 110, the quantity demanded is 80 units. So there's 80 units demanded at the price of $80 for sellers. The quantity supplied, where we hit the supply curve, is 80 units. So our new quantity is equal to 80 units. All right, and then I know I didn't ask for it, but let's just take a look at the incidence. The difference between our initial equilibrium, and the new price buyers pay, so PB minus P, that's going to represent the incidence for the buyers, and that's 110 minus 10. And so the buyers pay $10 of the tax. The difference between the equilibrium price and the new price that sellers receive is the difference between 100 minus 80. So the sellers are paying $20 of the tax, and for a total of a $30 tax. So of the $30 tax, buyers have changed the amount that they're going to pay by $10, and the sellers changed the amount that they paid by $20. So even though, right, we see that this is $30, it looks like the buyer's paying the whole thing, sellers had to adjust their behavior as well. They couldn't charge the same price that they did before. They had to adjust their prices so that the buyers would remain in the market. All right, so as we continue on, let's look at this tax incidence and start to introduce the idea of elasticity. So let's first suppose that supply is more elastic than demand. So the supply curve is going to be relatively elastic, relatively flat, and the demand curve is going to be very steep. When that's the case, if there is a tax placed on the market, the difference between the price that sellers received and the initial equilibrium is going to be the burden that the sellers pay. So this represents the tax incidence for the sellers who have very elastic demand. They're very price sensitive. They're going to leave the market if the equilibrium or if the price falls too low. What about the price that buyers pay? Well, buyers aren't price sensitive. Buyers aren't going to leave the market if the price increases, and so they're going to pay more of the tax. So the more elastic supply, the less of the tax that they will pay. Less tax. All right, buyers have more inelastic demand, and so they pay more of the tax. And so when we have elastic supply, inelastic demand, the inelastic side pays more. And then let's look at case 2 in this market. So case 2, demand is more elastic and supply is more inelastic. And in this case, again, sellers aren't going to be price sensitive. Sorry, but sellers are not price sensitive. They're going to look at the price and say, I'm going to produce the same amount no matter what. And so we have a very steep supply curve, whereas our demand curve is flatter. We can draw on that exact same tax wedge. These tax wedges are identical in size, but what we find in this case is the buyers pay a much smaller portion, because if we were to change the price for buyers, they have very elastic demand and they're going to leave the market. As a result, the sellers bear a greater portion of the burden. And so whenever we have very inelastic demand and elastic supply, the buyers bear more of the burden. If, however, we see that the elastic falls on the demand side and the inelastic falls on the supply side, the reverse is true. Sellers are going to bear more of the burden. Okay? Sellers bear more of the burden. All right, so whichever side has more inelastic, who is less price sensitive, is going to bear the greater burden. But what if it's the case where, and I'm going to delete this for just a second, what if it's the case where both demand and supply are inelastic? What if both are inelastic? And so I'm going to make a quick drawing here where we have quantity and we have prices and we have a demand curve that's not perfectly inelastic but very inelastic, and a supply curve that is also very inelastic. And let's draw in that tax wedge, and even if it's a big tax wedge there, we see that inefficiency is going to be very small, and what we refer to as inefficiency is going to be that little area here of people who left the market. Okay, and so when we have supply and demand that are very inelastic, there are very small changes to our entire market. There are small changes to the market, not very many changes. It's more efficient to have it when both supply and demand are inelastic. Let's instead look, okay, what if both are very elastic? what if we have a very elastic demand curve and a very elastic supply curve? So both of our curves are pretty flat. And let's try and draw a pretty similar size tax wedge. What we see is this triangle here of buyers and sellers who left the market. It's much larger than it was in the previous example. And so when we have both supply and demand as elastic, the efficiency loss, or the people who are leaving the market, is much greater. It's less desirable to have a tax when we have very elastic demand and supply because there's so much loss to society. The quantity moves significantly further from our equilibrium quantity to our new quantity with our tax. Okay, so elasticity, depending on if it's on the buyer or the seller or even in the market in general, can have a great difference or a big difference on not only who bears the burden of the tax, but also the effect of the tax on the market. The goal of policymakers is typically to make the effect minimal on the market, unless they're trying to really discourage the consumption of something. And so when we see this tax on the market, typically we're aiming to put the tax on goods that have very inelastic demand and supply so our markets don't change very much. All right. Now let's talk briefly about subsidies. So subsidies is a term that we don't hear very often, but it's going to be the reverse of a tax. So whereas when we see individuals in like our pizza example, we paid $1 for the tax, or we paid $1 for the pizza, we had to add $1 tax, and our total then was going to be $2. The reverse would be true if the government really wanted to encourage you to purchase pizzas. And they said, for every pizza slice that you consume, we'll give you 50 cents. We'll give you 50 cents for every pizza slice. So now I don't have to pay $1 for the pizza. I subtract out my subsidy because the government's paying 50 cents and I only have to pay 50 cents and the seller still takes home $1. All right, so when do subsidies exist? Subsidies exist in things like childcare, right? The government wants to incentivize people to work. And so to incentivize people to work, to make it more affordable for them, they're going to subsidize childcare. They make it more affordable by saying for each child, we're going to give you X dollars to send your kids to daycare. We also see education subsidized. Education is subsidized because we want to encourage our workforce to attend colleges. We also see many agricultural products are subsidized in order to help out farmers, and sometimes our low-income individuals in our society are subsidized through helping purchase grocery items. And so we have many subsidies that exist, but let's look how a subsidy can impact our market. And you can already see, right, we already know that this is the price sellers receive, and this is the price buyers pay. And what we're going to see is that buyers really like these low prices, and it's not just buyers that are going to benefit, but we're actually going to see that the sellers also benefit in terms of the higher prices that they receive. All right, so again, we're going to look at a per unit. Many subsidies are going to be a flat amount or a percentage, but we're going to just look at a per unit. So for every item or every unit you purchase, the government is going to subsidize you X number of dollars. Okay, so when we're thinking about our subsidy, remember, our price sellers receive is going to be a higher price. Then the government comes in and pays a subsidy. So they're going to pay for part of the cost of the product, and then the price buyers pay is going to be the other piece. So what we're going to find is the price buyers pay is going to go down and the price sellers receive goes up. And that's going to occur when we move to the right of the equilibrium. From our tax, we move to the left. Now we're going to move to the right. We're going to stop when the price difference is the difference between our supply curve and our demand curve. All right, so what the government did is they come into our market and place a $30 subsidy on the market. All right? So initially our price is 100, and at 100 there's 100 hotels that are bought and sold. But the government comes in and decides, well, we want to subsidize these purchases. So instead of our hotel bill saying hotel $100, total $100, it's instead going to say hotel room price sellers receive minus a subsidy, because the government's going to pay $30. And so the price buyers pay is actually going to be the price sellers receive minus the $30 that the government paid for them. And so what we need is our supply curve, because our price sellers receive is greater than the price buyers pay, we need the supply curve to be above the demand curve, and that only happens when we move to the right of the equilibrium. Otherwise, our subsidy is going to be exactly the same as our tax. This tax wedge, or this subsidy wedge right here, the difference between 110 and about 95, it looks like, is only 15. So we have to continue on, and here we see that sellers are receiving $120. The government pays $30, and consumers pay the remaining $90. So now we have hotel is equal to $120 minus the subsidy of $30, and so the total bill for our hotel room is $90. All right, and so this is the price buyers pay, and we can tell that's exactly the case because it's where we hit our demand curve. Price sellers receive is this where we hit the supply curve at 120. What about the quantity bought and sold in the market? At a price of 120, the quantity supplied is going to be right over here at 120. Let's get rid of that so we can see it. And the price demanded, or sorry, at a price of 90, the quantity demanded is also 120, and so the quantity is 120. So price sellers receive is greater than the price buyers pay, and at those higher prices for sellers, sellers are more happy about the situation, so the quantity they supply goes up. Demanders are happier about their lower price, so the quantity they demand increases, and we move from 100 units to 120. Again, we can also look at incidence and say, compared to our initial $100 equilibrium, how much did the buyers benefit? Well, the buyers used to have to pay $100. Now they pay $90. So the incidence for the buyers is $10. The incidence for the sellers is the difference between what they receive now and what they used to receive is $20. And so the total difference is $30 in the market. All right, so that concludes our subsidy example. Oh, I have some notes there. All right, so for continued examples, make sure you check out the More Practice folder, the extra practice problems, and worksheet examples that are available to you along with Lecture 6.